So let's talk about this Apple Watch software as a medical device clearance. I'm going to go through this and just give you my thoughts as we go. So, first thought here, this says that users can measure. We can probably assume that the user, what this refers to, is people who own an Apple Watch. So, those people are not going to be people that have any sort of medical training necessarily. This would be categorized like an over the counter type device, and it has different risk control issues with this. Like you can't assume that the user is going to know about the practice of medicine and be able to properly control for certain risks that you otherwise could have if this was a prescription only device being used by another clinician. So they've also specified which hardware platforms that this watch works on. It's probably safe to say that this is another software only medical device. However, even as a software as a medical device, it obviously still needs to run on something, right? So typically, as a SAMD, you would still specify your hardware compatibility requirements, but you still need to specify like CPU requirements, RAM requirements, other requirements that someone wanting to run your software should be able to run your software with reasonable assurance that it works as intended. So also, here that this uses an algorithm to detect signs of moderate to severe sleep apnea. Reading between the lines a little bit here, but probably what had happened is that the device was not sensitive enough to detect mild sleep apnea. This is another important pattern is that your algorithm doesn't need to work across all cases. There may be a subgroup where your device doesn't perform well, but you can add this to your label, right? You don't necessarily have to go and spend the additional R&D to make it work on mild sleep apnea. You just add it to your label that you don't support mild sleep apnea. Just exactly what's done here. This is a very common pattern. So here they get into specific technological characteristics of the device. As it says here, Apple developed the Apple Watch algorithm, which uses accelerometer data. So now we know how this algorithm works and the technological characteristic of it. It's not using like the blood O2 saturation. It is using device or the movement of the device in order to predict moderate to severe sleep apnea. That's important. You need to tell FDA how your device works in order for them to understand it, in order for them to understand the risks involved, and in order for them to do the review properly. They also go into their reference standard. Ground truth is also another term for this. However, this goes beyond FDA. It's more on asking the question, how do you know that your device works? And the key aspect is you can't use your device, an output of your device, to validate itself because that would be circular. So you typically need some external value, some external system to give you confidence that your device is working as intended. That could come in the format of a human doing an annotation, or in this case, comes in the format of a separate device or separate method of establishing that ground truth. So also one other thing that I might mention when I was talking before about the moderate to severe sleep apnea, it may be the case that they weren't able to detect mild. However, there's really two values in the equation necessary to decide should we spend more R&D on it or should we just remove it from our device labeling. The other important part of that equation is the clinical and business value of said feature. So mild disease was probably determined to be low enough clinical and business value to not be worth it. So therefore, given probably the costs involved in the study and maybe the cost involved in like R&D to make the algorithm work on it, it wasn't worth it. So that's just another thing I would like to talk about here as they go into the clinical aspect of this. It's always a good idea to have something like this in your FDA submission because keep in mind that the people that are doing the review may not have a clinical background. And if FDA uses lots of people to do a review, and there's going to be different people reviewing separate sections, So it's always good to give some background to the reader and also to the FDA reviewer. Found that that does help. So I'd like to talk about this kind of diagram here. So what you're looking at is A, B, and C come from the Apple Watch. This is the signal that they are measuring. And then D and E come from the at-home apnea measurement device. And so this is the ground truth. And the cool thing about this is the ground truth here is being measured at the same time as their signals are being measured up here. And you'll also notice that they say human scored events, and that's because they likely had someone go through and score these events as they normally would in normal clinical practice. The nice thing about having the data lined up like this is that you can now the location and timed human scored events. You also have the airflow meter to verify that. You can use it to test your algorithm, or probably also you can what was used is to train. So you have labeled pairs of data sets here. You have time series XYZ, IMU measurements, and then you have time series ground truth that are aligned with that. So you can use that to train machine learning, which probably we could guess that this does use some sort of machine learning principles, probably some deep neural nets, perhaps even some sort of transformer architecture. Not sure, it might get into a little bit later. Okay, so this is a very important topic. So the word generalizability is extremely important. This doesn't mean statistical power. Just because a study is powered does not mean that it has crossed the threshold at FDA for them to consider it's going to generalize the rest of the US population. That's a much more difficult thing to prove. Process that Apple used here is to recruit a diverse population, and they control for factors such as age, sex, race, ethnicity, BMI. Definitely BMI is an important thing to control for or to have broad representation for this type of device because we know that pathophysiologically, BMI is a strong factor when it comes to sleep apnea. That is a strong risk factor. And also biomechanically and physically also, it makes sense to have this. Notice here that they didn't say prove generalizability. It's not something that you could prove until you get into the post market, until you get your device FDA cleared. Really, this wording to enhance performance generalizability. That's what you're trying to do, and you're trying to show FDA that you have done your due diligence and that your test set is a representation of the US population, and it is going to generalize to that population, or most likely will. So as we saw here, that reference recordings were conducted simultaneously. So this is what I was talking about earlier in that previous diagram. It looks like they also did this for the test set, but I would suspect for the training set, they had done something similar as well. While they're doing the in-laboratory sleep study and the at-home sleep study, the users are wearing the watch. And here they mention the certification of the ground truthers. It's also very important. Your ground truth is only going to be as good as the people certifying or annotating that ground truth. It's important to use the right people. The FDA also puts a lot of value on the US technologists, which seems like that's where these particular technologists were based in the US. And the reason they ask for that is FDA cares about how this generalizes to the US population and to the US practice of medicine. So by asking US experts to establish the ground truth, you are capturing the practice of medicine as well. And yeah, this is the reason why that's important. So they also go into details about how many nights, how many participants. They also say that some participants contributed multiple nights. This may or may not have been on purpose. However, they potentially may be trying to do like a test, retest, or a reproducibility study on this, where they show that their device is reproducible in the same patient with similar conditions. That's certainly possible. So actually backtrack a little bit. This is actually for the training step. So they call it the design phase of the algorithm development. So they're talking about their training data set. They also talk about the test data set, and it's important not to call this the validation data set. Unfortunately, validation is used in too many different ways. So the testing data set is from 727,220 patients across 2,542 participants. And this next point is also very important. None of the testing set was used in the design phase. And they go on to reinforce that by saying it again in another way. That is to say, i.e., testing set was sequestered unseen from the algorithm during the training phase. And then they go into the demographics in the test set. And they don't break it down in the training set, but this also highlights another point. Oftentimes, where the training's already done and that data's already been collected and it wasn't collected with the most rigor in mind, and this data may not be available during that. Certainly, something like that may have happened here. If you have demographic information for your training set, it's great. It's not strictly required, but for the test set, you should always have that information in there. So then they go on to describe the algorithm of how they generate the report. And it's clearly described here what they do. So every 30 days, if there's at least 10 recordings, then the user will get a notification if at least half of those were elevated. So you might be asking where these numbers came from. Probably these are variables that were either established up front as like these are reasonably known, or probably it's like a set point. Like they have the training data, probably not the test data is used for this. The training data, they will tune that set point, that sensitivity of the device to maximize the sensitivity and specificity score. Um, and exactly in the very next paragraph here, I think they're saying just that, where the trade-off, the operating point is to balance the sensitivity and specificity goal. And probably the thing they use to tune is these variables up here. So there's 50% within the 30-day period. You could imagine if you set this to 10%, then you would increase your sensitivity, right? But your specificity would go down. So perhaps those 3 nights were just because that person had too much coffee, just like the night before, or like they just had a bad sleep or whatever. And so that will result in more false positives. On the other hand, if you'd set this to a higher number, you would be more confident of a positive diagnosis, but you might miss people that have moderate disease. So that's where this trade-off comes in. And they even say here that the operating point was intentionally chosen to favor specificity. So they would rather have less false positives and have high confidence for when they do get a positive result, that result is more meaningful. It translates to positive predictive value. And likely the low sensitivity, going back to my previous comment about mild, moderate versus severe disease, this device only looks at moderate and severe, and that they have deliberately chosen their set point to have a higher specificity. So it's less sensitive to mild disease, which also is how they make the set point for the ROC curve. It reflects the intended usage of the device. You'll see here that here are the performance targets that they have published. So 66% sensitivity and 95% specificity. So this means that if you have sleep apnea, Apple Watch will yield a positive 66.6% of the time. If you don't have sleep apnea, Apple Watch will report a negative 95.9% of the time. So here they have done a subgroup analysis on sex, BMI, race, ethnicity, interesting periodic limb movement index, which makes sense because probably a common objection to this or a common source of error would be like if you just have your hand movements, right? Like movements other than breathing. That's important to do a subgroup analysis on confounders that you feel could affect the accuracy of your device. Sometimes these confounders are like the type of scanner that was used or the scanning protocol that was used. And the way that I do this, it's a lot like risk analysis, where I look at the output of said device and trace it back all the way to the input, all the steps along the way. And for each step, almost like a neural net training, you figure out where the errors come from, what's the potential contribution of those errors into that step. And then that will give you an idea of what confounding variables or what other outside variables is most likely to affect your results. And you should have data collected. If you don't have data for those variables, you should enrich your data set for that and also do a subgroup analysis to show FDA that even, for example, in this case, even with high limb movement index, that the device still works. Also, even with a co-sleeper, that's an important one. I didn't quite think about that one, but it totally makes sense. I don't know about you. Sometimes my wife wants to kick me off the bed, so I could understand how that could result in error. And so these are just proving, or these are just showing. Again, you can't prove that this is going to generalize, right? But it's showing that you've done your due diligence and you have looked for potential errors in the system, and you've shown that your system is resilient to those potential errors. This table is just a breakdown of their training set versus their testing set. It's also a good idea to show that there isn't any significant biases or differences between your training set and your testing set. You can actually use your training set as additional evidence for generalizability. If your training set captures a wide demographic, then that certainly would imply that the algorithm has been trained on that variability, and that just adds to the case. Doesn't replace the need for your testing set to also be diverse. Data also, if you augment your data, especially if you can augment it in a way where you can potentially simulate periodic limb movement, if you can add that into your training time data augmentation, that again adds to the case that your training set represents the US population, your intended population, and that your algorithm will then generalize to that population. So here they go on to talk about some more details about the study design, and they show the cutoff threshold here, and they show that this is using AISM clinical standards, which I think is the standard of care that reflects practice of medicine in the US. And then this is important. The people establishing ground truth are blinded to each other and the results of the algorithm. It's not good practice to show the ground truthers the output of the algorithm because they'll be biased to that output. And you'll have artificially high scores from that. So this is also a common practice here where you have two technologists that pre-annotate the data. And if there's a disagreement, then a more senior clinician would then decide between which one would essentially break the tie. So this is a common technique that I've seen, and this is one that we use as well, where you have each case is read by at minimum two readers. And if there's a disagreement between those two, which you can determine automatically by preset rules, like you can determine if the dice agreement is lower than a certain amount, whatever. Then you have a third reader that's usually more experienced than the other two will come in and break that tie. So I'd like to backtrack a little bit. So the previous items we're talking about here, that was done in the preclinical stage. So while the software was still being developed, or perhaps even before the software was developed, they'd collected this data and they split it up into design, what they're calling testing here. But they had the watch on the subject's recording, but the algorithm was not completed yet. So they were just using the watch as a data collection device at this point. And while this this test set here, I'm not sure I would call it that, but the validation set here was done on the actual completed device. And I'm going to read a little bit further down, but I don't think that like the three XYZ traces were available. They're just looking at like the final clinical output of that. So they probably tested this device across 30 days, but let's just keep reading to see. And so they say here that they have enriched the population with more moderate and severe sleep apnea, which makes sense because probably that they would have gotten a lot lower, probably wouldn't be able to properly power the study perhaps if they just went with a blind sampling of the population, which would just get you the prevalence. So it looks like they have a primary endpoint of just the specificity and sensitivity, but they peel back the layers a little bit with a secondary endpoint where they call this accuracy of individual night breathing disturbance values here. This is an interesting diagram. Yeah, I'm not a biostatistician, but we probably would have used a Bland-Altman plot for something like this. Probably an easier way to see if there's any bias in the data. From this graph, it doesn't look like there is. It looks like the red line seems to be a slope of 1. But a Bland-Altman analysis would just be easier to quickly look at, to read. And I think that's what they're trying to accomplish here is the agreement between this breathing disturbances, events per hour, the ground truth. So while this is not the final outcome, the final outcome is are you likely to have a sleep apnea condition or not? This is a important test point in the middle somewhere where you can show FDA that not only have you validated your entire device end to end, but also you've peeled back the layers of the onion and you have test points at various locations within that. It's almost like a circuit design, where like in a circuit, you will have these test pads that are exposed copper, where they will tap into various parts of the circuit. During the usage of the circuit, obviously those pads are not going to be used because the whole thing is going to be enclosed in some sort of enclosure or whatever. But during the manufacture and test, you will have those pads and you will have a jig that comes in probes and measures each one of these points. Similar to that, where you have the completed device, you test it as a whole, but then also you have these test points inside where you can probe, measure, and validate that your device is working not just end to end, but also it's transparent and it works at each of the individual blocks as well. And that's what they're trying to do here. They probably could have come up with a lot more secondary endpoints, but I think this one is probably one of the more important ones to go for. This is why they specifically did this one. Keep in mind, this is an internal document from Apple. It is publicly available. This is not the 510K summary, which we don't have at this time of the recording. We don't have this yet. Probably get that sometime in early October. But this gives us an idea about probably what's going to be in that 510K summary once that does come out. And like we were speculating about software-only medical device, it is a software-only medical device as you can clearly see here, software-based medical device. This is not going to be the device intended use, but I could probably imagine that like the wording could be similar. You'll notice here, tracking breathing disturbances during sleep can also help users discover patterns over time. This is a general wellness indication, so likely they are paving the way for future indications, and they don't think that's going to be something that they have to go to FDA for. I think general wellness indications. Whether or not this makes it the final 510K summary, I'm not sure, but this establishes the thinking at Apple probably that they have these general wellness indications. And yeah, for example, like they say here, lifestyle factors such as alcohol, exercise, all these things, these are things that you don't have to get FDA clearance in order to develop, sell, market. And they say here performance was validated in engineering studies. I think they call it the design set and then the testing set. That was done by Looks like that was done by the engineering team, although the data was collected clinically, perhaps not in a format that very closely matches clinical practice. So that was done by the engineering team, and I would argue that level of evidence may have been sufficient for a software-only device like this. However, they may have wanted to make some additional claims, or they may have wanted to de-risk the human factors studies, so they ended up doing one more study, which they call the clinical validation. And they did that in a more faithfully replicated clinical environment, perhaps to also use this as a maybe a lightweight human factors engineering type study if FDA were to ask for that. But I think it's interesting. I think they went a little bit over and beyond at least what's necessary for FDA and obviously global medical device regulatory authorities. I think that's where the real world clinical evidence might come into play more there. However, as far as my understanding, FDA, there's a high chance I think would have been able to get something like this cleared without the need for that additional prospective study. So it's saying here, we're probably going to see similar wording in the 510K summary where it says this feature doesn't take into account other symptoms and it is designed to point the user, so the patient, to their healthcare provider for subsequent diagnosis, confirmation. And yeah, it says here they should speak to their physician. So this is not the end of their diagnostic workflow. It is just the beginning. We're almost certainly going to see language like this in the final 510K summary. Also, they have more clarifying language because it's a screening test. Or actually, it's a screening test that favors specificity, which is like they're basically saying here the absence of a notification isn't intended to indicate absence of sleep apnea because they have tuned the device to be more specific than sensitive. This is probably the reason why they've added this, and probably they're going to include that in their final labeling because the sensitivity of the device is lower than what it could have been. They probably did this for a usability reason, right? Like they mentioned somewhere in this document, they didn't want a lot of false positives because then people would lose trust in the system, right? That's probably why they favored high specificity over high sensitivity is for the public perception of the device. Probably less so on like that decision, if I were to guess, came less from the risk controls and probably more from like the business risk. Or so came less from a safety risk, but probably came more from a business risk analysis there. So yeah, so we're coming to the end here. Yeah, hope you found this kind of commentary useful. If you found it useful, please comment. If you want me to do more of these in the future, please let me know. Yeah, if you're creating something similar to this, I think the software at the med device route is very smart, and the big players are using it. So that's validation for this type of strategy to get regulatory clearance. If you're working on something similar or someone that is, and you guys want us to help, we can get it done fast. You don't have to use this, obviously. You're definitely free to use our resources, free templates, try to help wherever we can. But we also do provide white glove service in order to not only guide you, but also even write the documents for you. And we use our software engineering, data science, and also clinical full staff team members in order to craft those documents for you. So if you're looking for a pain-free and guaranteed pathway to market, please reach out. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.